Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Daniel Greene, president of the Newberry Library. Thanks for joining us for today's program, The Deportation Machine, America's Long History of Expelling Immigrants. The Newberry is an independent research library in Chicago with collections spanning more than 6 centuries of human history in Europe and the Americas. We've been free and open to the public since 1887. Recently, we reopened our doors to readers and visitors. You can visit our website to make an appointment to do research in our reading rooms, or you can drop by the library without an appointment to see our fall exhibition, Renaissance Invention, Sardanus's Nova Reperta. For the safety of our community, our public programs will remain online for the foreseeable future. We continue to offer research and learning opportunities through a range of digital resources, online classes, and virtual public programs like this one. So I invite you to visit our website, newberry.org, to check out all we have available for you. You're also welcome to follow us on social media for more opportunities to engage with our collection, staff, and stories that bridge the past and the present. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Adam Goodman. Adam Goodman is an assistant professor in the Latin American and Latino Studies program and in the Department of History at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He earned his PhD in history at the University of Pennsylvania. He's been a scholar in residence at the Newberry Library, where he worked on the book we'll be discussing today, The Deportation Machine, America's Long History of Expelling Immigrants, which was published earlier this year by Princeton University Press. And during the program, feel free to drop questions into the Q&A feature, which many of you will see at the bottom of your screen, depending on what kind of device you're using. And we'll do our best throughout the program to take some questions from the audience as well. Welcome, Adam. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much for having me, Danny. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm only sorry we can't do this in person at the Newberry.
I know, me too. I wish we could be there. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I wrote so much of this book at the Newberry Library that I'm eager to get back and to keep on working.
Good. Well, we look forward to seeing you there as soon as that's possible. Many people who are joining us today won't have read your book. It's an engaging read. I recommend it highly. So do pick it up. But for those who haven't read it, Adam, can you just tell us what's the story of the book?
Of course. The book, The Deportation Machine, traces the long and troubling and bipartisan history of the US government's efforts to terrorize immigrants in the United States and to expel people from the country. And this is a story that is certainly not uplifting, though I think it's timely, it's important. It's something that certainly has been in the news a lot in recent years, but as my book shows, it's hardly new. It's not something that emerged during the Trump administration. And I started in the late 19th century with the anti-Chinese expulsion campaigns. And I go all the way up to the present with more recent targeting of Muslims, South Asians, Arabs, as well as Central American refugees and asylum seekers. And a couple of startling realizations I made while researching the book really led me down this path. It took me a decade to research and write. Which in academic terms perhaps isn't that long, but sure felt like a long time along the way. But a couple of things that I realized as I dug a little bit deeper into the research, first was that the United States has deported 57 million people during the last 140 years. And that's more than any other country in the world that the supposed nation of immigrants, nation that's welcomed immigrants throughout its history, has expelled. And the second thing is that during the last century, US officials have expelled more people than they've allowed to remain on a permanent basis, which shocked me as I crunched the numbers and realized that. And it also led me to the question that begins the book, and that is, what kind of nation is the United States? So the Deportation Machine explores that question and traces the history of this expulsion apparatus, as well as people's concerted efforts to contest it and to fight against it.
There's so much that I want to pick up on, especially the long history of deportation and referring to this as bipartisan. But maybe before we get to those questions, The metaphor in the title is the machine, right? So what is the deportation machine? How does it function? Who allows it to function?
So the deportation machine is, something that the federal government started constructing in the late 19th century when they gained control over immigration enforcement. And I call it a machine because there are three main mechanisms, that compose it. Three main expulsion mechanisms that officials at the local, state, and federal levels, as well as ordinary citizens in some cases, have used to force and coerce people out of the country. The first, many people are familiar with. Those are formal deportations. Now, when we think of deportation, what that process looks like, I think a lot of times we imagine perhaps a judge presiding over a case, hearing its merits in a formal setting, in a courtroom, and people having a chance to fight for their right to stay. And that actually represents a small percentage. Only 10 to 15% of deportations throughout US history have been through formal deportation. And in more recent years, those formal deportations have actually been streamlined. People's due process rights have been curtailed. But that's what the media and what most other scholars have focused on. What I realized was that we know little to nothing about the vast majority of all the deportations during the last century and a half that have happened through a coercive mechanism euphemistically called voluntary departure. Okay? There's nothing voluntary about them. People are forced to leave the country. These are more or less administrative expulsions that happen after apprehension, and federal officials would coerce people and pressure them to agreeing to leave the country on their own, in part to avoid long stays in detention, in part to, avoid more serious and severe penalties that included 5, 10, or 20-year bans on reentry, or even lifetime bans on reentry. And what I liken voluntary departures to in the book are the role that plea bargains play in the criminal justice system, if we think about it that way. Most cases in the criminal justice system never make it to trial. People take plea deals because they're threatened with horrific penalties, decades-long periods in prison, potentially. And as a result, they agree to a plea deal, a lesser offense, perhaps, or a lesser sentence. And voluntary departures operate in a similar way. And that's how 85% or more of deportations throughout US history have taken place. And the last mechanism, just to very briefly address, are what we sometimes think of as self-deportations. Some people, if we can remember back to 2012 with Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, feels like many lifetimes ago at this point, but his main immigration policy was self-deportation, essentially to make people's lives so miserable that they decide to pick up and leave. And this sometimes happened through local laws that were very restrictive and denied people basic rights and benefits they needed to live in this country. But it also happens sometimes through violence and the threat of violence, as well as fear campaigns, which I trace in the book. So that's why I refer to it as the machine, because there are these three mechanisms that have been operating throughout the last 140 plus years that officials have relied on in tandem with one another to maximize their power over immigrants, both to expel people, but also to exert control over people's lives in the United States.
So it would seem to me, as historians, we go on the hunt for evidence, right, to back up our claims. And it would seem to me that the voluntary departure wouldn't leave the same kind of paper trail, right, that a judicial trial would for historians today. And you talk about this a little bit in the book. I mean, you say, I think at some point, the machine is designed to leave no paper trail. So how does that affect the task of the historian? How'd you do this? I mean, how did this change how you worked if this machine is not supposed to leave a record of itself?
This was one of the real challenges. The project almost stopped before it even started. Mm-hmm. I went to Washington, D.C., and I talked to a woman named Marion Smith, who many immigration historians have consulted and worked with, who recently retired. But she's really the person responsible in the federal government, in the immigration bureaucracy, for organizing and making their records accessible. And she more or less told me, there are no records on voluntary departure, let alone self-deportation. I mean, that was part of the point, right? I mean, part of the point was to speed everything up, to minimize the costs, the number of days in detention, the number of immigration hearings, as well as the paperwork I mean, you can only imagine how many, if there's 57 million deportations throughout US history, imagine the paperwork and the number of warehouses that would be needed to account for all of that. And so this was part of the process, and that made it very challenging for me as an historian. But what I ended up doing was, scouring archival records, certainly of the government, but also of organizations across the country that worked on behalf of immigrants, and some enforcement organizations like the National Border Patrol Museum in El Paso, Texas. Court records proved really instrumental. And I also did a lot of work in the Mexican archives, and I did dozens of oral histories. I was interested in not only tracing how the immigration bureaucracy changed, but also how deportation had affected real people's lives, which I think is oftentimes left out of the story. I found a way to do it in the end, although I'm not going to lie, there were times along the way where I wasn't sure I could pull it off.
How did you find people to interview? How did that process work for you? And were people, for the most part, willing to talk to you?
This was an interesting thing. People were willing to talk. I was somewhat surprised, I guess you could say, but people were very willing to talk and to share their stories of how deportation and migration had affected their lives. And I did interviews in Chicago and Los Angeles and Texas, as well as in Mexico, in some small towns. And sometimes it was going to the historic migrant sending region in central western Mexico in the state of Jalisco, where there are towns that historians and scholars in the social sciences have worked on that have generations of migration. Most families have experiences with migration, and in turn, many with deportation as well, because those two things are so often aligned throughout US history, especially for Mexicans, which I think we'll hopefully talk about in a little bit. But this was something that I was really eager to do, was to talk with people, especially in the more recent decades, because the records of the National Archives are incredible, a wonderful resource for migration scholars, but they dry up in the late 1950s. So what are you supposed to do after 1957 when all of a sudden, the trail goes dry? Well, some people had told me at the time that I was embarking on the research that you can't do it, impossible to do. That was a discouraging thing to hear early on in the process, but through the legal records, through these migrant organizations, and through talking to people, I was actually able to piece together, I think, very detailed and fine-grained history, which is what I was aiming for.
I want to talk with you about why Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans become the central focus of the machine. But there is a question first from a listener named Joanne. She just wants to understand why you started in the late 19th century. Can you just say briefly a little bit more about that, and about maybe also about the idea of legality and illegality around the process of immigration in American history? Why is the late 19th century the place to start?
That's a great question, and thank you for that, Joanne. I really start in the late 19th century because that is when the federal government gained control over immigration, in part through a series of congressional acts and a series of Supreme Court cases, and that gave the government the exclusive authority. Right up until that point, it was localities and states that exercised authority over immigration. But in 1891, the federal government gets control over immigration. There's an immigration bureaucracy, a structure that is created. And in the years and decades ahead, that's when people really start to see the expansion of that bureaucracy and the targeting of a number of different groups, right? So it's actually, as I mentioned in the beginning, the Chinese who are the first group of people really targeted by the immigration service in the late 19th, early 20th century, and actually excluded under the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was subsequently renewed multiple times. And as soon as these lines are drawn, as soon as there are legal channels through which people could enter the United States as determined by the bureaucracy, then there were people that entered without authorization. And this question of legality and illegality that you asked, I think really stems oftentimes from the policies themselves. I mean, it's the state policies that are creating these categories, which then map onto broader groups. And we should be mindful of that they can change over time. And in fact, they have.
Right. So then there is an important part of your book is this major shift in the 19 teens and 1920s, where in who is being deported, we see more Mexican immigrants then become the central focus of the machine. So why does that happen? How does that happen? Nothing about it is, or is it inevitable that it happens?
It's not inevitable. I mean, it's the product of a number of really factors that I map out. And, certainly some of those have to do with where we just left off. And that was the series of restrictive immigration laws passed at the turn of the 20th century. The United States has long relied on immigrants as a source of labor. And people have also wanted to reunite with their families, very understandably, who are split across borders. So in the late 19th century, many of the laborers who laid the transcontinental railroad from the west heading east, were Chinese migrants. As the Chinese Exclusion Act cut off that source of labor, employers turned to Japanese migrants to work in the agricultural fields. But through a series of binational negotiations, that source of labor was cut off as well. And then, as many people might be familiar with, the restrictive immigration acts of 1917, 21, and 24, sometimes thought of as the national origins acts, because they cut off migration from Southern and Eastern Europe. There had been tens of millions of migrants from those regions that had come to the United States in the decades around 1900. And as these sources of immigration were cut off, as these sources of migrant labor were cut off, employers started looking more and more toward Mexico, which was excluded from the 1924 national origins restrictions. They could still come, and there was demand for that labor. And people came in increasing numbers, and also they were targeted disproportionately, really starting in the 19-teens. During World War I, there were a large number of guest workers that came, tens of thousands of guest workers came from Mexico. And I found, previously undiscovered records documenting the use of voluntary departure as early as 1907 or 1908. The federal government initially said that, according to the official records in the historiography, they said that they had started in 1927. But in fact, officials started targeting Mexican migrants much earlier. I think we should recognize that. And then, as I show in the book, it's from that point on, for the remainder of the 20th century into the 21st, Mexicans are disproportionately targeted. As many as 90% of all deportations in the 20th century are of Mexican migrants. And that's out of proportion with their percentage of the immigrant population and of the undocumented immigrant population. And that had a real effect, a real detrimental, harmful effect, I would say, about shaping public ideas and notions of, who is an American, who is a supposed illegal alien, quote unquote. And these policies, went a long way to shaping these ideas that then are passed through the media and from politicians' mouths into the broader culture.
How do you understand the relationship between the policies themselves and the prejudice around these policies? We see different groups being targeted at different times. Does the policy follow the prejudice? Does the prejudice follow the policy? I'm sure it's not that simple, but how have you thought about that?
That's a great question. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts as well in your own work on related issues. But I think that it really does go both ways in a lot of senses. Certainly the question of race and inherent racism of some of the people enacting these policies played a big role. But also migrants were seen and have been seen throughout US history, and as I document in the book, as economic threats. Oftentimes there's this idea that there's a zero-sum game. Like a migrant comes in and takes away someone's job, and that someone is usually, in the person's head, a white American, even though, that doesn't work that way. But in addition to economic threats and perhaps racial and cultural threats, public health is certainly something we're all aware of today and thinking about a lot in recent months. Migrants have been seen and thought of as vectors of, disease historically, and not just any one group. What I found is that so much continuity exists in this story. Sometimes who is targeted changes, but why they're targeted doesn't necessarily change. There's a handful of reasons, as I just mentioned. And that was really enlightening. So many newspaper headlines, if I strip the dates away and show them to you, it could have been from the late 19th century, from the 1920s, 1950s, 70s, or today. Very hard to distinguish. And that continuity, I think, was really eye-opening for me.
Right. Yeah. The only thing I would add to that, I agree with you, is sometimes the perceived national security threat around immigrants as well, right? Which we've seen we've certainly seen today, but it's, again, like you're saying, it's not new. We could see that certainly around the era of World War One, during the interwar period as well. The idea that immigrants are a threat to the security of the nation.
That's a really important qualifier, something that I should have mentioned, and something we're thinking about this week. I mean, tomorrow is the anniversary of September 11th. Things have certainly changed since then in the last 19 years, but even a century before, as you mentioned, during World War One, the Red Scare, the Mexican Revolution, right. These questions of immigrants as a security threat were very real and shaped policy.
Right. We have a lot of good questions, so I want to turn to some of them. Someone named Della asks, are there any ways to find evidence of those who were denied entry to the U.S. over the last century? And how do you find evidence of people who have been denied entry?
That's a great question. A lot of those records would be in the National Archives, in the Immigration and Naturalization Service records, which is Record Group 85 for anyone interested. But they have wonderful records up until the 1950s. And even better for us these days, as we're mostly stuck in place, is that some of those records have been digitized and included in databases like Ancestry.com. Mm-hmm. So entry certificates and cases about particular people, if you're looking for someone in particular, you can search by their name and pull up documents related to their specific cases. I did that a lot using the Newberry Library's resources. Very appreciative of that. But I think the National Archives would be the place to start, and there might be some databases that could take you there, even if you can't make it to Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and this intersection of genealogy and
That's right.
Historical research is something so important to us at the Newberry too. So Carol asks if there's any way to figure out the percentage of deportees who make it back into the country.
Carol, this is a great question. This is an important question. This is one that I tried really hard to answer. Long story short is no, there's no way to figure out what specific percentage historically have made it back into the country, but we know that for most of the 20th century, it was very common for people to be deported, to return to the United States, and sometimes to have another encounter, an apprehension, and a second, a third, or fourth, or a 10th deportation for that matter. They're general stats that I found, and I actually filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Department of Homeland Security to try to get at this information, and unfortunately, it doesn't exist. But we do know that, in the period of the mid-1960s to the mid-1980s, as many as 25% of all people apprehended had prior deportations. And I think that we should question and think a little bit deeper about what that means for individuals, where deportation became a fact of life for many people, kind of normalized into their everyday lives. And I think that that's something that most people and most scholars certainly haven't reckoned with.
All right, Sarah wants to push you on terminology here. So I'm curious what you think about this. These terms, voluntary deportation and self-deportation, why you chose to use those terms, even though in your book you so clearly demonstrate that it's often the result of intimidation or coercion, and it's rarely voluntary. You do couch this well in the book, but for those who haven't read it, can you explain the value of using those terms, even though this is often so often a coercive process full of intimidation and fear?
Yeah, these are the official terms, at least voluntary departure, throughout the archival record of the immigration bureaucracy. These are the terms that they're using. Right? It really means an administrative deportation. That's essentially what it is, a fast-track administrative deportation that happens unilaterally, with little to no legal process. And I wanted to be sure to historicize and to be able to trace the history of that tactic. Right? I think there's something important about the Immigration Service's decision to call it voluntary departure, although that too changed over time. And anyone that's done any digging in these records and looked into immigration history knows that oftentimes categories, statistics change dramatically over time and are difficult to trace. But I wanted to use their categories, that is the categories of the federal government, while also questioning them. I think that's important to do. And to show how these different mechanisms operated. It's not to conflate. I want to be clear, I'm not conflating between the three different mechanisms. I think there are important differences between them, but I am saying that they're all part of this larger machine that officials have weaponized and utilized to deport tens of millions of people throughout US history. And if we just look at the formal deportations, we only get 6 or 7 million, and perhaps it's 8 million at this point, 8 million of the 57 million deportations throughout US history. Right? So we need to look at all of them and also recognize the differences.
And Adam does a beautiful job at the beginning of the book, laying out these three categories and the reasons for using them. I mean, I've been studying U.S. immigration history for a long time, but it completely reframed my understanding as well. One of the things you say in the book too.
Danny, I have to say thank you.
Yeah,
thank you. The introduction is 8 pages long.
It's great.
I probably spent 30% of my time on the introduction. So I'm glad that it came through and you thought it was effective.
Absolutely. One of the things that really surprised me too, I mean, it was one of those moments where I thought, of course, I should have thought of that, but I haven't. You argue there's profit to be made in deportations, and that there's also a desire among the US government to punish deportees. So I'm curious if you can just tell the listeners a little bit about profit and punishment and how they're linked.
For sure.
And I think you may also have some images to show around this.
Yeah, no, I'd love to show some of these images, if we could pull those up. But yeah, one of the things that I found was that, so this is a family of Mexican deportees during the 1950s. This is, a representative picture in some sense, in that it wasn't just male laborers. There are oftentimes families, women and children who were included in immigration operations and deportation. They were embarking on a 400-mile trek by foot back to their home in San Luis Potosí in central Mexico. But if we can go to the next image. One of the things I realized as I dug a little bit deeper as well into this research, as you mentioned, was the intersection of profits and punishment, played a crucial role in shaping immigration policy, right? And it's also immigration policy that turned deportation into a lucrative business. That's something that we should recognize. That's something that we really need to be aware of. It's, the policies that made expulsion profitable, but it was the intersection of punishment and profits that have long shaped US history. Here we see just one example of that. So I trace the history of buses and trains and boats and planes that have been used mostly from the 1920s to the 1970s in my book, but certainly since then. They've been used to carry out expulsions. These private transportation companies, sometimes US based, sometimes from outside the United States, were utilized by immigration service officials to deport people, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. Here we see a group of Mexican deportees about to board a Flying Tiger charter flight. This was the preferred airline of the immigration service at the time. It started during World War II. A group of former fighter pilots in the East had started this large cargo carrier company that saw deportation and human cargo as part of its business. And they deported tens of thousands of people in the 1950s and 60s and beyond. Some people may have heard of the famous Woody Guthrie song, Deportee, Plane Wreck at Los Gatos, the return of a group of unnamed, until recently, Mexican migrants, on their way to Mexico, who were killed in a plane crash along with immigration service officials on board. And if you're interested in that story, Tim Z. Hernandez, the writer, has done incredible work to uncover the stories of the migrants, who were buried in an unmarked grave. But that was actually what most people don't realize. That was a charter flight. That was a private company that carried out that flight. And this had a real impact on deportees, on people's well-being. And if we can go to the next image, what I trace more than anything else was the story of a boat lift operation that happened from the mid-1950s for a couple of years, in which people were transported by two different private Mexican shipping companies that took bananas from places like Tabasco, as you see there at the map, up to Alabama. And on the return trip, they would pick up deportees in Port Isabel, Texas, in the lower Rio Grande Valley, and take them to Veracruz. And I trace the history of that operation that took around 50,000 Mexican migrants. And people might understand the incentives for the company were to maximize profits. So they had kind of really bare bones conditions aboard these ships. If we can go to the next image. And what we see is that these ships were designed for cargo transport of fruits, essentially, sometimes cement, and other goods and products, not for people, not for human beings. The deportees recognized this. They clearly stated, there's these incredible archival documents in which they say, before they mutinied and brought an end to the operation, they say, these ships are designed for cargo, not for human beings. But the Immigration Service treated them as cargo purposefully because they wanted the bare bones condition and the treacherous trip across the Gulf of Mexico to discourage people from returning to the United States. We might think of it as a precursor to what we now know as prevention through deterrence policies, most recently seen in the separation of asylum-seeking families, from Central America. If we separate parents from children, they'll be less likely to come, right? And that's something that has a longer history. Most people haven't realized that these 1950s operations acted in a very similar way. The General Joseph Swing, who was head of the Immigration Service at the time, stated in congressional testimony, he said, he said, Mexicans hate the boat lift like the devil hates holy water. I mean, they knew how trying this journey was, and they consciously used it. And one of the things, I'll just close here on this particular thought, because this photo you see here, I don't know if you can see on the right-hand side, there's a boy, kind of a teenage boy perhaps, staring up at the camera. This photo is of one of the holds of the ships on which these boat lifts took place. And he's looking directly at the camera. And that really haunted me, I think. His gaze back at the camera and wondering what the experience would have been like for him. What did the mixture and combination of punishments and profits mean for real people? And that's what I was trying to get at in this chapter, and to show that it's the state policies behind it, and it's also different policies that could undo punishment and profits as the drivers.
Right, and it's feeding the machine. So then you talk about the 1970s also as a key turning point for understanding the history of deportation in the United States or out of the United States. You talk about it as the dawn of the age of mass expulsion. What does that mean, and why does that happen in the 70s? What's the turning point? What precipitates it?
Yeah, I refer to the late 1970s, the dawn of the age of mass expulsion, because as I tracked the numerical history, kind of the data, followed the numbers, I realized that it's starting in the mid to late 70s that apprehension and deportation became a fact of everyday life for many people, especially in Mexican and Mexican American, for that matter, communities, right? So statistically, we look, and it's starting in the late 1970s that hundreds of thousands of people, as many as an average or so of 900,000 people a year from the late 1970s until the early 2000s are deported, right? And immigration raids, which we certainly have heard of in more recent years, they started up and they were carried out on a regular basis. People that I interviewed, I did oral histories with people that immigrated to Southern California in the late 70s and early 80s. They described very similar things that are happening today. They, out of fear, stopped going to the market, stopped going to the movies. They even stopped going to Sunday Mass when Border Patrol agents and immigration investigators started targeting, those spaces. And, I think that speaks to the fact that deportation and the deportation machine has not just been the act of physically removing people from the country. It's also involved controlling people's lives and shaping the lives of people who remain, right? And I think there's some reasons for that, certainly. But this is the start of a period in which immigration enforcement ramps up and goes on to the present, I think. And it's also the start of the period when we start to see people organizing and pushing back in new ways.
Well, we have a lot of good questions in the Q&A, but I do want to ask you about, as historians, we also always want to give voice to people whose voice was often trying to be suppressed, right? And you write about resistance to deportation in the book. I wonder if you can talk about that. I mean, is there any way to beat the machine?
That's a great question, and it's one that people have thought of and considered and wrestled with, ever since the machine came into being. Immigrants have been organizing, pushing back, fighting against the machine and against punitive policies, from the beginning. So I trace that throughout the 140 years that the book covers, but I really zoom in the 1960s, 70s, and beyond, coming out of the Chicano movement. In the immigrant rights struggle really comes into its own in the 1970s. And what activists and organizers do is that they realize first and foremost that the deportation machine is vulnerable. Right? How it's vulnerable changes over time, but they realize it's vulnerable and they try to apply as much pressure as possible on the weak points in order to gain some leverage. And that what I find through this one particular story is that they had tremendous success in many cases of broad-based solidarity and organizing among labor organizers, activist lawyers, immigrants themselves, of course, oftentimes at the center, leading these efforts, and people in the community. So I uncovered this story that most people knew little to nothing about, but I think it's a very powerful story in which there's an immigration raid in 1978 in suburban Los Angeles. 40 immigration agents descend at 8 o'clock in the morning on a shoe factory that employed hundreds of people. They went through the factory indiscriminately after closing off all the exits, and they questioned everyone just based on their appearance, racially profiled everyone essentially. And they returned to downtown Los Angeles that day with 119 people in custody. Half of those individuals that same afternoon were on their way to the border for deportation via voluntary departure. But the buses never made it to the border that day, because what had happened in the background that neither the workers nor the immigration agents were aware of was that this activist network had sprung into action, in part because they were already organized. And they had filed an injunction with a federal judge who stopped their deportation. They ended up fighting their case. Many of them had their deportation stayed. They were able to remain in the country. And through a larger class action lawsuit, they implemented major changes in the rights of migrants before immigration agents for up to 1 million people at that time. It started with 60 people, 60 shoe factory workers, that had an impact for all the undocumented people in the country in 1978. So that's just one example, but these stories are really important and crucial to understanding the machine because the machine has changed in response to these activist efforts as well.
But the urge to deport from the federal government, I want to get back to something you said all the way at the beginning. You called this bipartisan. This urge to deport. Can you explain? Because a lot of our questions are about the 21st century,
Sure.
because we're living in a moment where the history that you've written about is so urgent today. And I want to get to some of those questions, but I think there can be, in our polarized political world, there can be often the misapprehension that there's no bipartisanship. Here, unfortunately, we actually do see a bipartisan effort to deport immigrants. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this was also very eye-opening for me as I dug deeper into the research. This project started when I started working on it. It was not during the Trump administration; it was during the Obama administration.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important to recognize, kind of the historical context, upon which it came. And I think that what I saw, throughout U.S. history is that in many cases, regardless of who was in power, Democrats, Republicans, the deportation machine kept on going. There's bureaucratic inertia and momentum behind it. The Immigration Service itself, its task is to apprehend, detain, and deport people. Mm-hmm. It also has a service function, but enforcement has always been more important. And that bureaucratic momentum has meant that regardless of kind of whatever the policy is at the top, there's oftentimes a gap between that policy and what happens on the ground. And under Democratic and Republican administrations, we've seen that the machine has continued to deport people regardless of any kind of humanitarian measures that people have tried to implement. There's also been obviously the constant need, not to get too deep in the weeds here, but the constant need for immigrant labor, right? Kind of the capitalist impulses driving the machine and the marginalization of migrants that led to their exploitation, as well as in many cases, as I document in great detail, the racism both of individuals and of the institutions that they directed. So that's what I talk about when I'm referring to the bipartisan history, is that it's not as if the Democrats have been quote unquote good on this issue and the Republicans bad. I mean, they've both largely been in favor of punitive enforcement policies that have wreaked havoc on the lives of migrants. And I should note, not just non-citizens, but also many US citizens and permanent residents.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a question from Kimberly about how the history of deportation over the 20th century, if we can call yours a long 20th century, maybe late 19th century to today, how does that fit with U.S. refugee policy over the same history? When we're talking about acceptance or non-acceptance of refugees, are we talking about a completely different category, or are there overlaps and relationships here? I should say there's not a lot about refugee policy in the book, but have you? So I'll put you on the spot anyway and ask you about it.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
No, this is an important question. I think in a lot of cases there is an overlap, that we should recognize. And I do talk about refugee policy in the 6th chapter of the book, really since 1980, what that's looked like. But it's not the focus, by any means. And there's wonderful work that people have done on these questions. I encourage people to check out Maria Cristina Garcia's work, among many others, on these questions of refuge and asylum. David Fitzgerald's book, Refuge Beyond Reach, is another great resource. But what I would say is that, in some cases, the fact that the executive branch has had such tremendous power to decide who stays in the country, decide who's in, who's out, and carry out deportations also extends to refugees and to asylum policy. And today we've seen just the dramatic reduction in any kind of refugee policy that is familiar to the United States in the last 4 decades. And in many cases, refugees have had, special privileges and rights before the law. That's less so the case today. And we're seeing, I think, a real overlap in the last few years between, refugee policy and immigration enforcement policy and deportation, where most refugees today don't have a chance, to have their cases heard, despite national and international law. They're deported through fast-track expedited means, just as so many millions of others have been throughout US history. So it's a slightly different group, but certainly an important one, for understanding what's happening today. And what I realized is that so much of the deportation machine has been shaped by the history of labor migration, and just statistically, that amounted to an overwhelming focus on Mexican migrants, and certainly groups before and after them. But on refugees, I'd recommend checking out some of those other works that I mentioned.
Yeah. Another question that goes a little bit beyond the bounds of the book itself, but I'm sure it's something you've thought about. I mean, we're living through a public health crisis right now. We have the questioner is asking. I don't see a name on this question, but he or she is asking about undocumented immigrants in Chicago today. Are there self-deportations that we know of going on? The person says they're especially interested in hearing about Mexican immigrants in Chicago, but also the sense of just how the impact of COVID may have mapped onto deportations, self-deportations, voluntary departure.
Yeah.
Is there anything, do we have much evidence of that over a 6-month period yet?
I mean, there's certainly been people that have been studying this and writing about it, mostly journalists at this point. What we do know is that the current public health crisis, the pandemic, has been extraordinarily difficult for everyone, and even more so for undocumented people in Chicago and in other places across the country that might not have qualified for stimulus checks from the federal government. They might not have easy access to health services in general, and they may be on the front lines of many of the essential workplaces, right? And I think this is something that some have taken for granted, is not surprising to others, but people need to recognize, I think, the disproportionate impact that the pandemic has had on the immigrant community, and also the fact that immigration operations from ICE and the Border Patrol have continued throughout the pandemic. They've actually spread the pandemic by deporting people who were COVID positive to Central American countries and elsewhere. That's been documented and shown by incredible journalists. And I would just mention, in response to the part about self-deportation, that I should note that most people have not left the country in response to these fear campaigns and scare tactics. And those have been ramped up to perhaps previously unknown levels, certainly things we haven't, levels we haven't seen in recent history in the last few decades. But most people have stayed. They've shaped the lives of immigrants in the United States, but most people have not picked up and left, right? And they've continued to find ways to make a life here in this country.
I could talk to you for much longer. It's been a fascinating conversation. I want to just take the privilege to ask the last question, and you raised it rhetorically in your first answer. Are we a nation of immigrants? How do you, as an immigration historian, how do you square, or how do you come to understand our desire to tell ourselves a story that we are a nation of immigrants with this history of deportation, and is it just a myth that masks some kind of ugly reality going on the ground, or how should we think about this? And maybe why do you think it's so urgent, or it has been so urgent, at least until this administration, when it's changed, actively changed, to call ourselves a nation of immigrants?
I think the two go hand in hand in a way. I mean, the United States is a nation of immigrants, and it's been welcoming to many people throughout its history, but it's also always been selective in who it's admitted and who it's welcomed. Right? And the fact that so many millions of people have come to this country have also meant that there are millions of people in the country, that could be deported. So rather than thinking of the U.S. as either a nation of immigrants or a deportation nation, as the legal scholar Daniel Canstrom has put it, I think we should see that the two go hand in hand. They're complementary in a way, and they're complicated. It's difficult to disentangle these two contradictory impulses. And I think that we should recognize perhaps the ways in which the country has lived up to the ideals. And this isn't just unique to immigration history, of course. Right. We can think about the founding documents and all the ways in which have always fallen short. But I think that when it comes to questions of immigration, this tension between the U.S. as a nation that's welcomed immigrants and a nation of immigrants, and one that has targeted immigrants for apprehension, detention, and deportation will continue into the future. I don't see an easy resolution or a way out, perhaps, but that's part of what makes this question so enduring and so important. Who is targeted, who is welcomed, may change over time. But the fact that immigrants have so often been used as scapegoats for other problems facing our country, real problems, economic hardship and otherwise, that the solutions don't rely on targeting immigrants or excluding or deporting immigrants. They rely, lie in other areas. But so often, we've seen migrants scapegoated, and that's something we should first recognize, in my opinion, and then look to change.